επόμενος ομιλητής είναι ο Christian Hill.
The next speaker is Christian Hill. He's a CEO of MAP Biopharma, a company specializing in market access issues in different European countries, Canada, Japan, Brazil, and Turkey. He has been involved in over 60 HTAs and pricing procedures globally, and he has been through posts of responsibility in companies such as Intermune, Gilead, Pfizer, Genzyme, and he has worked on a broad range of products and disease areas from chronic diseases to ultra-orphan indications. He's a member of the steering group of Ethical Medicines Industry Group in the UK and Ireland. He is also a member of the board of the European Confederation of Pharmaceutical Entrepreneurs. His topic will be market access for pharma and medical devices in Europe.
Thank you, Nikos and HBio, for inviting me to speak today on the fourth hurdle, primarily. What I mean by the fourth hurdle is reimbursement, which comes after the first three hurdles in regulatory terms, which are safety, efficacy, and quality. I have 20 minutes to get through 20 content slides, so I will speak quickly. I will, however, happily distribute the material in PDF or whatever to attendees. I'll also be around in breaks to answer any questions. There are several topics that I'm going to cover up here, and I'll try and get the balance right between quality and quantity of information. So a little bit first about MAP. Dawn, sitting at the front, and I founded MAP about 6.5 years ago. It was MAP Biopharma that we first founded. MAP Biopharma is an entity that helps companies to gain access to consulting intelligence insights on the launch and reimbursement of hundreds of thousands of different products. We have a HTA, a Health Technology Assessment Database, which tracks every drug that has been reimbursed in the UK, Ireland, France, Germany, and a growing number of countries. We're clearly very excited about that in the sense that we can help lots of companies at once instead of on a more traditional consulting basis, one at a time. We then founded MAP Medtech a couple of years later in 2014, and that does the same thing for medical devices, diagnostics, and others. And then we collectively call that MAP Online, which sits under the umbrella group company MAP Life Sciences, which also has a traditional consulting practice attached to it. We're also part of a new network that launched this year to help companies across Europe. So I'm a great believer in anyone saying that they can do a full reimbursement procedure on the national level without actually being there is on a hiding to nothing. It's unlikely. We pick up a lot of mistakes of other companies when the company goes to one big player that claims they can do everything. And in our experience, it's very, very difficult. So a quick overview of pricing reimbursement with a couple of examples. I'll test you on the small text here. No, you're not meant to read this. This is an example of the procedures available in the UK, just the UK. First of all, there's pricing up here, and then you get into horizon scanning with the health technology assessment organisations before you drop into either health technology assessment or non-health technology assessment procedures to actually get somebody to pay for the product. This is complicated and time-consuming and often very expensive with a relatively high failure rate. So it's not something to go into lightly. If you compare that to Germany and France, you can see a similar array of processes but far fewer boxes. So this is meant to give you an idea of Germany is kinder, albeit more legally arranged than the UK. France is quite complicated and not many companies' first choice of country to enter the market. All of this is coming under increasingly the watchful eye of an organisation called EUnetHTA, which is the European Network of Health Technology Assessment. And they are pulling together various approaches to assessment of clinical effectiveness, overall effectiveness, so it's efficacy and safety overall, and there are several work packages in place. You'll see many countries are leading or co-leading each one of these. It's rather ironic that NICE in the UK are co-leading implementation when one of the biggest challenges for NICE is implementation. So I just find that slightly ironic. But there are lots of states that are joining together to gain from this new holistic view. Now, this could be good or bad for Biopharma and Medtech. Some positives are that if you, as an innovator, decide or intend to launch a product across Europe, clearly this has some advantages. You could get a one hit, that could be very good. In the current plans by the Commission, they intend to have a mandate so that if you go through this UNETA process, which is currently free of charge, if you go through this UNETA process and you get a positive guidance from that on the clinical benefit assessment, every national member state has to take into account that positive. If you get a negative, then they have to consider it, but they don't have to make it a negative. And that brings me to the negative insights. Clearly, if you get a negative on the European level, that hurts. And that is a very, very big risk when you go down to the national level. Ultimately, pricing and reimbursement are reserved rights for member states. So unlike the European Medicines Agency, who license products on behalf of Europe, this UNETA procedure, despite having some mandatory elements to it, they cannot overrule the member state if they decide to fund something. But if they decide not to fund something, they better have a good reason why. So there are various factors that influence reimbursement across Europe. I'm going to talk about some of those now. I'll try to do these quite briefly because some of them can be a 20 or 30-minute talk on their own. So I'll introduce these topics one by one, and then if there are questions that people have, I'm happy to talk over lunch. So first of all, international reference pricing and launch sequencing. There's three elements that are important here. One is there are lots of differences between countries, so that's a national differences issue. As I said, pricing and reimbursement are reserved rights for the member states. You'll see on these colour-coded map of heat map of Europe, there are some red countries where they pick a minimum of a basket. Orange is an average, yellow is slightly kinder, and then up to green where there's no referencing between the or two other member states, not officially anyway. The other element is convergence. So we saw that with the UNETA slide a couple of minutes ago, where lots of countries are coming together. Now that's on the European network of HTA side. There's also various collaborations, including Greece now, in several collaborations of sharing net prices across Europe. Now there are three that we're tracking at the moment. All three of them are increasingly leading to the availability of net prices in various countries in Europe, and that can be problematic for companies. There's a famous case right now in the UK where the Health Select Committee is threatening to release the commercially confidential prices that Vertex has negotiated with the UK health authorities. Now, that's going to hurt, considering that the UK historically has a very strong reputation of protecting net prices because they don't want to lose those deals. I think somebody in the Health Select Committee or the government needs to think a little bit before they start publishing net prices, because tomorrow's prices might not be quite so low as they are today. It's not rocket science, but politicians. The third element is adaptive pathways. So Hans-Georg Eichler in EMA has regularly tried to push the agenda to get things through the regulatory path as quickly as possible to accelerate patient access. We'd all agree that's a good thing, but that raises some challenges, because the quicker you accelerate access through the regulatory path, the less mature your data package, and therefore the higher the uncertainty. Payers don't like uncertainty. Again, not rocket science, but it's a difficult reality. So there are some factors here that you can read for yourselves that influence the prices that are referenced. The interesting elements that we try to talk to companies about in terms of comparisons in terms of caution is pharma companies don't directly control their own prices. Sometimes governments foist on them rebates or various other elements that have to result in a change to price. The second one is countries should ideally only compare to comparable other countries, but that often doesn't happen. You have a huge fluctuation in the way the methodology of referencing, which we're trying to open up as a policy debate in Brussels and other countries to get people to understand it's maybe not fair for a second or third world country to pay the same prices as a first world country. Maybe a first world country should pay more. And then finally, we heard a lot about patents. There's a lot of variation in terms of how each product is assessed and then priced. So there's a lot of challenge in the market. We have again, you won't read this, but this is like an old-fashioned mileage chart of city versus city, and then you read across to see who, how many miles it is to each city. This is like that, but for pricing. So who references who, and how do they do that? We've done this a lot for the last few years and learned that many of these rules do not matter, because in practice, these countries have a public policy of doing something, but then they do not do it. Or worse, they do not have a public policy of doing something, and then they do it. So the uncertainty around international reference pricing and pricing research, most of our clients that are in phase 1, 2, thinking about pricing research, forgive me anyone involved in pricing research, we do some ourselves, it's a waste of money, just don't bother, because 9 times out of 10, the real price that you get when you launch has no bearing on the original price that you get in research. So it's a bit frustrating when companies spend 200,000, 300,000, 400,000 euros on pricing research that is utterly irrelevant. It's not always the case, of course. So now an example of if you get a marketing authorization at month 0, if you try to make that product available in all countries at once, what's going to happen? In our experience, if you have an ATU, which is the temporary authorization in France for early access, usually for orphan diseases, usually things that are severe, then you can get payment actually pre-MA, but you can get a lot of money, which is helpful. There are some consequences to that, but ultimately you have a lead-in period before you get your final price achieved. Similarly, in Germany, you can get price from day 1, but then there's a final negotiation with the insurers to lead to the final net price. In other countries, it's a huge mishmash, and there are some where you can, like in the UK, you get a possible reimbursement within 3 or 4 months of marketing authorization, but most likely you'll end up in a mix of these kind of scenarios. So it's theoretically complicated, but practically actually quite simple if you think about it first and do a very small amount of research that does not need to cost very much. Finally, on the pricing element, there are various first-tier countries. So free pricing system, we like these, I mentioned earlier on. The second-tier countries tend to be the ones that are a little bit mixed, and some companies have had bad experiences, so others try to learn from that. And then finally, and often, unfortunately, Greece is included in this category. There is a third tier, launch last usually. There is another category which maybe not launch at all, but those are few and far between. Switching gear a little bit with an eye on time, devices and diagnostics. So often these are funded by disease resource groups or health resource groups. Sometimes you can get access to health technology assessment, and often it's a mix of the two. This is fraught with issues, and very, very few companies understand it when they go in. What we try and do is just demystify it, take away all the kind of mystic halos and say, look, it's actually quite simple. You could do this, this, or this. Decide on one of those paths first and try and explore it without spending lots of money on the detail. This is complicated. You don't need to read all of this. It's for reference. The links work as well in the PDF when you get it. There's a recent judgment. We heard about supplementary protection certificates earlier, and these are only available under this new judgment by the CJEU. They're only available for the drug, the medicinal product, because there was a case that went to court that had a mixed use. So there's a medicine and a device or diagnostic in the same package. But just because they're bundled together doesn't mean that the SPC can relate to the device. So in terms of patent protection, I don't understand all of this. I'm not a lawyer, neither am I a patent attorney. There are other colleagues in the audience that you just heard from who are far better than me to speak about this. But it's quite complicated and companies don't think about it. Final slide on this topic is HTA and DRG or HRG as an example. Some countries like the UK has 2 primary routes to reimbursement for medical devices and diagnostics. However, they result in guidance but not the funding. The health authorities can choose to ignore them. There is a precedent case called Rose versus Thanet in the UK, which is an increasingly famous case where a patient took the local authority to court because they said no to a procedure that NICE had recommended. However, on going through the legal appeal, they found that actually the local health authority just wanted to say no because of price. They didn't have a good clinical reason to disagree with the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence in the UK, and therefore they were made to pay for that procedure. The irony is when, they really should have thought about this before the court case, when it actually got to treatment, they found that the patient wasn't eligible, which was really sad for the patient. However, they should have checked that before. However, it's a really critical case for patient access in the UK because that means anything that NICE produce comes with a pseudo mandate to say if you do not like the idea of funding this, you better think about it carefully and have a very good clinical reason, not just, no, shan't fund it, we've run out of money. That doesn't work. There is also the DRG HR system. This is relatively similar across most countries in Europe. Often products run into trouble when the DRG or HRG tariff, the amount of the pot of money for a certain procedure, for a certain diagnosis, when that isn't enough to cover a new device or diagnostic, then you have to go outside of the tariff. That can take 2 or 3 years. It's not simple, quite complicated, but you can go for local funding outside of the tariff without changing it. And that's where we found the most success. So if you have a device or a diagnostic, there are those routes available without having to go to the national level, and those local routes can facilitate the change nationally on their own, so you don't have to push too hard. Meta is a slight plug for us. We're one of only a small handful of companies that have been signed off by NICE to offer this directly to companies, and they've actually expanded it to say that they're happy for this procedure to apply not just to medical devices and diagnostics, but also to drugs, which it was not designed for. The procedure is a Medtech early technology appraisal process, and it helps companies to have an idea of what are the evidence gaps, what am I likely to fail as a result of that I could change. It's a very low-cost procedure, nothing like the cost of a full HTA, and we've actually found that some authorities outside of the UK are now paying more and more attention to this because it's like a mini HTA. Now, generics and value-added medicines, I know there are some organisations in the room that have developed these and commercialised them. This is a small snapshot of a much bigger table that we've created that allows you to see the kind of differences across Europe, enormous differences. For those that have already launched across Europe, generics and value-added medicines, you'll be aware of this anyway. But one of the interesting elements that was slightly surprising to me was the fact that you can launch in the UK without a license, which is interesting. Now, you have to have permission to do that, but you can get reimbursement for things that are technically unlicensed. NICE actually also run an evidence summary of unlicensed and off-label medicines and devices. So they actually produce, not guidance, but a summary of a device or medicine to give people an idea of what effect it might have. And for value-added medicines, what I mean by this is something that can have incremental value beyond the original generic. Maybe it comes in a slightly different formulation, or it comes with a device or a diagnostic as part of the package, but it has some sort of extra value implicit. Sometimes they may be eligible for HTA, which can be a very positive thing, because if you can measure that extra value in the patient terms or the carer or family of the carer terms, then NICE will pay an uplift for that. And increasingly we're seeing some of those NICE guidance being taken up by other authorities across Europe. I don't know how the B word, Brexit, will affect that. Maybe once March has come next year, maybe everyone will not talk to us anymore, which I wouldn't blame you for, by the way. But yeah, that might lead to some changes, but maybe not. Other processes in countries, Germany, there's no HTA for new formulations of existing active ingredients. I've already mentioned the UK, and then France, to be eligible, there must be something new in there in terms of a new way of treating the condition. Poland is interesting as another outlier, so they have something. Now, managed access agreements. So increasingly deals are being struck, often relying on confidential prices. One of those examples that is public is Vertex, where they have this managed access agreement, but the Health Select Committee were making threats to publish that. I'm not going to spend very much time on this chart. It's a very, very simple, oversimplified representation of some of the different deals available between innovators and the governments across Europe, not just Europe. But the one interesting fact that I'll pull out is that the one down here, this is the one that most often gets used, even across Europe, which is slightly sad considering that the only thing it does is limit budget. It does not address all of these areas of uncertainty, which is a little counterintuitive. Increasingly, we're beginning to see payers start to look at this as an idea of a way to manage the overspend in the future, but in the past they haven't found very many good ways to achieve that. There's a case study here, Bellis. This was GSK's product that was acquired by Orchard last year. It's a very rare condition, very, very rare condition. GSK launched the product at a relatively low cost, believe it or not. Most gene therapies are around about the $1 million US dollars mark, and the managed entry agreement in this case was if it doesn't work, they'll return the money, which is a pretty good guarantee of a gene therapy product. So in conclusion, there are various differences across Europe from a pricing reimbursement perspective. They're best to map early on. You can avoid price erosion if you get the launch sequence right and you get the right procedures in the right countries. And managed access agreements do work as long as an over-enthusiastic politician doesn't threaten to release the net price. But we'll see where that lands in the coming days. Thank you very much.
So the first statement is that most startup companies will try to license their drug. This is the first statement. The second statement is that to do a health technology assessment, you have to have your efficacy, your pivotal data, efficacy and safety. So it's very likely that the partner would do that. My question to you is, for those companies that are on the way, what can they do, or is there anything to do, or they should not do anything and let the partner do it?
So letting the partner do it is clearly an option, but that reduces the likely value that they perceive in the product. If the company can do some things in advance proactively, there are primarily one mechanism that can do this really, really well, and then one less robust mechanism. The first one is scientific advice. So some organisations across Europe offer scientific advice quite early. This is at phase 2 design, sometimes just going to phase 3 design. Even as late as the phase 3 protocol is locked, but the stats analysis plan hasn't been finalised, you can still get European and or local national level advice at that time. That can help to identify what some of the pitfalls are, what some of the opportunities are in the data. One example was a joint EMA and NICE GBA from Germany and also TLV in Sweden attended one that we did late last year. The interesting thing there was the German authorities and the UK authorities were having an argument in front of EMA and everybody else in the room, which was wonderful, highly entertaining. But the element that was really, really useful was that they agreed a compromise on the type of quality of life instrument that they would be willing to accept as part of the value demonstration of the product. Now, if the company does that, for that particular product, it won't launch until 2024. And this was late last year. It's a long time before launch of a product. It will probably be a huge blockbuster. It's a really big indication. Obviously, I can't go into detail, but just because that works for a very big indication doesn't mean to say it can't work for a small indication, and it doesn't cost very much. So they should do that. The second one is Meta that I referred to earlier on. Although I have a bias, a conflict of interest because we offer it, so I would say this, if you have a look at it and use somebody else, you don't need to use us. There is a way of getting a very, very simple back of envelope estimate of where is this headed? Is it likely to fall down a really big crack? In which case you can put something there to stop you falling down the crack. So definitely do some things, but keep it simple and don't spend 300,000 to 400,000 euros on pricing research.
Thank you very much for the nice presentation. So you showed a slide where the contribution of generics to the pharmaceutical expenditure is low despite their number. But that was general for Europe and also for US. So do you have any country in your mind that they may be using higher generic penetration to finance innovative products reimbursement in Europe?
The easy one is the UK. The UK's got huge uptake of generics. They've actually got a special fund that was launched. It was announced last year, but only really available this year through the Office for Life Sciences. That meant that if you can demonstrate some savings in one area, you can use those savings to offset the cost of a new area. So if you're an innovative company with some access to generics, or you know which generics could help, you can create a business case and apply for those savings to be used to offset this cost. Now in gene therapies, we're working with about 10 gene therapy companies at the moment. 2 of those are actively looking at those areas to make a business case. And that's not only useful now in the UK, but also in Belgium, where they're actively looking at this. And there is a collaboration, which you might have heard about, Benelux, which is Benelux, Austria, and now Ireland as well. Ireland has massively changed their approach to generics. But the UK is the most obvious front of mind one, although it's easiest because I'm from there. Thank you.